They say the West breaks you slow, like a bone that never heals right. But for Clara May, it happened all at once. One unlocked door, one desperate sprint through hell, one frozen river that should have been her grave, and one man who'd sworn he'd never save anyone again. This is the story of a woman who ran from the devil and a soldier who'd forgotten how to be human. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Clara May decided to run was the kind of night that swallowed screams whole. It was late August in the Montana Territory, 1882, when the heat of the day finally broke and gave way to a darkness so complete it felt like drowning. The Dusty Rose Saloon. Tucker Shaw's empire of sin and slavery stood like a festering wound on the edge of Salvation Creek, a town that had long ago abandoned any claim to its name. Inside, the piano played a tune that once might have been cheerful, but after years of smoke and blood and broken promises, it sounded like a funeral march. Clara May stood in the back room, her bare feet cold against the splintered floorboards, staring at the door that shouldn't have been open. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain someone would hear it. For 3 years, that door had been her boundary between captivity and the outside world. For 3 years, it had been locked every night without fail. But tonight, old Charlie the guard, who drank too much and remembered too little, had forgotten. Just forgotten. Her hands trembled as she gripped the door frame. The bruises on her arms were fresh dark purple blooming across pale skin like poisonous flowers. Her lip was split from where Tucker had backhanded her that afternoon when she dared to refuse a customer, a fat banker from Helena who smelled like cigars and entitlement. Tucker Shaw didn't tolerate refusal. He didn't tolerate anything that threatened his profits or his control. "Your property, girl," he'd hissed in her ear afterward, his breath hot and rancid. "Don't you ever forget that." But standing there in that doorway with the cool night air kissing her bruised face, Clara May allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in 1,000 days' hope. She didn't grab anything, didn't pack a bag or steal food or take a coat against the coming cold. There was no time for planning, no room for second-guessing. Every second she stood there was a second closer to discovery, a second closer to Tucker's fists, or worse. So she ran. The first 10 steps were the hardest. Her legs, weak from malnutrition and months of confined spaces, screamed in protest. Her feet, soft and unused to anything but wooden floors and thin carpets, found every rock and thorn in the dusty street. But pain was nothing. Pain was familiar. Pain was preferable to what waited for her back in that room. She cut behind the saloon past the stables, where the horses snorted, and stamped past the outhouse that reeked in the summer heat, past the chicken coops where the hens clucked nervously at her passing. The town of Salvation Creek was small, maybe 200 souls if you counted generously, and it ended abruptly where the wilderness began. One moment there were buildings and lantern light, and the sounds of drunken men singing off-key. The next there was only darkness and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Clara May plunged into the forest without hesitation. The woods were thick here, dense with lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that grew so close together their branches interlocked overhead like grasping fingers. What little moonlight existed couldn't penetrate that canopy. She ran blind, her hands outstretched, feeling her way through the darkness like a drowning woman reaching for the surface. Branches whipped her face. Thorns tore at her dress, a thin cotton thing that Tucker had picked out specifically because it was easy to remove. She felt the fabric rip, heard it catch and tear on brambles, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. Then another. Then voices, men's voices, rough and angry. "Clara May, you get back here, girl." It was Silas Tucker's right hand, a mean bastard who'd broken 3 of her ribs last winter when she'd tried to run before. That attempt had lasted maybe 30 minutes before they'd caught her, dragged her back, and made an example of her in front of all the other girls. She still had scars on her back from Tucker's belt. This time would be different. This time she'd die before she let them take her back. She ran harder, her lungs burning her bare feet, leaving bloody prints on the forest floor. A root caught her ankle and she went down hard, her palms shredding on sharp stones. She bit back a scream, tasted blood, where she'd bitten through her tongue, and forced herself back up. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't think. Just run." The voices behind her were getting louder. She could hear multiple men now, at least 3 or 4, crashing through the underbrush. They had lanterns. She could see the distant glow flickering between the trees like malevolent fireflies. They had boots and guns and horses waiting if they needed them. All she had was desperation and the memory of pain. It had to be enough. The ground began to slope downward, and Clara May half ran, half slid down the incline, grabbing at trees to slow her descent. Her dress caught on a branch, and she heard it rip. Completely felt the cool air against her bare shoulder. Modesty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She yanked the fabric free and kept moving. That's when she heard it, a sound that cut through her panic like a knife through silk. Water. Rushing water, loud and close, growing louder with every step. The river. She'd heard the men talk about it, the ones who came to the saloon. The Clearwater River, they called it, though some of the old-timers insisted it had another name, something from before the white men came. It ran fast and cold, fed by mountain snowmelt even in late summer. Men had drowned in it, children too. It was dangerous, treacherous, deadly. It was also her only chance. Clara May burst from the tree line and found herself on a rocky bank. The river stretched before her like a living thing, silver in the moonlight that finally broke through the clouds. It was wider than she'd imagined, maybe 50 feet across, and the current was fierce, churning white around the boulders that jutted up like broken teeth. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that made thinking impossible. Behind her, the voices were close now, maybe 100 yards, maybe less. She came this way, I saw her tracks. Spread out. She can't have gone far. Clara. May stood at the water's edge, her body shaking so badly she could barely stand. The river was dark and violent and promised death, but behind her was certain suffering, certain return to that hell she'd barely escaped. At least the river offered a choice. At least drowning would be quick. She took a breath, one last breath of free air, and stepped into the water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It was mountain water glacier fed so cold it burned. Her feet went numb instantly, and she gasped, nearly losing her balance on the slippery rocks beneath. The current pulled at her legs, eager and hungry. There, at the river. Lantern light spilled across the bank behind her. She heard Tucker's voice, now recognizable even over the roar of water filled with the kind of rage that had always preceded his worst violence. Clara May. You come back here right now, or I swear to God. She didn't hear the rest. She pushed forward deeper into the river until the water reached her waist, then her chest. The current was stronger than she'd anticipated, trying to sweep her downstream, trying to pull her under. She dug her feet into the riverbed and forced herself forward one step at a time, her arms outstretched for balance. Somebody shoot her. Don't let her cross. The first gunshot cracked across the water, and Clara May flinched, nearly losing her footing. The bullet hit somewhere to her left, sending up a spray of water. She couldn't tell if they were actually trying to hit her or just scare her back. Either way, it didn't matter. She was committed now. There was no going back. Another step. The water was up to her shoulders. Her feet could barely touch the bottom now, and the current was relentless, shoving her sideways downstream anywhere but forward. She tried to swim, but her dress, what was left of it, tangled around her legs, dragging her down. She clawed at it, trying to tear it free, but her fingers were too numb, too weak. Keep moving, she whispered to herself through chattering teeth. Keep moving or die. But her body had other plans. 3 years of captivity of inadequate food and constant stress had left her weak. Swimming in a mountain river required strength she didn't have. The current caught her fully now, spinning her around, pulling her under. She tried to fight it, tried to keep her head above water, but it was like fighting gravity itself. Water filled her mouth. She coughed, choked, swallowed more water. Her lungs burned. Her arms felt like lead. The world above the surface seemed impossibly far away, the moonlight fading to a dull glow. On the bank, Tucker Shaw watched her disappear beneath the churning water, his face twisted with fury and calculation. He'd lost property tonight, valuable property that had taken considerable investment to acquire and train. But the river was cold and fast, and Clara May wasn't a strong swimmer. The odds were she'd wash up on a bank somewhere downstream in a day or two, bloated and blue. "Should we go after her, boss?" Silas asked, breathing hard from the chase. Tucker spat into the dirt and shook his head. "River'll do our work for us. She's dead already, just don't know it yet. We'll search downstream tomorrow, see if we can recover the body." He turned away from the water, his jaw tight. "But if by some miracle she makes it out alive, I want her found. You hear me? I want her found and brought back. Nobody runs from Tucker Shaw. Nobody." The men nodded and followed him back into the woods, their lanterns bobbing like evil spirits retreating to hell. In the river, Clara May had stopped fighting. The water was everywhere now in her lungs, in her eyes, in her ears. The cold had moved past pain into something almost peaceful. She was tumbling now, spinning in the current like a leaf bumping against rocks, getting pulled into eddies and spat out again. Her dress had finally torn completely away, lost to the river. She was wearing only her thin undergarments, translucent and useless in the water. The light above the surface was fading, not because the moon was setting, but because she was sinking deeper and deeper into the dark heart of the river. Maybe this is mercy, she thought. Maybe drowning is better than going back. Her body had gone limp. She wasn't struggling anymore, wasn't trying to swim. She was just floating, sinking, fading. Images flashed through her mind, disconnected and dreamlike. She saw her mother's face the way it had looked the last time she'd seen her 12 years ago before consumption had stolen her away. She saw the small house in Ohio where she'd grown up before the debts and the disease and the desperate decisions that had led her west. She saw Tucker Shaw's face twisted with cruelty, and then she pushed that image away because if she was going to die, she refused to die thinking of him. Instead, she thought about spring mornings, about apple blossoms, about the way fresh bread smelled when it was baking, about kindness which she'd known once in another life before the world had shown her its true face. The darkness was complete now. She couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything, except a strange sense of floating, of weightlessness. And then nothing. Clara May's body, limp and pale, tumbled through the black water as the current carried her downstream away from Tucker Shaw, away from the dusty rose, away from 3 years of hell on earth. The river had claimed her, pulled her into its cold embrace, and now it would decide her fate, whether to dash her against the rocks or deposit her gently on some far shore. Behind her, the lights of Salvation Creek faded into the distance. Ahead of her, unknown and unseen in the darkness, a different kind of man was rising from a restless sleep, troubled by dreams of a war he'd never escape, and ghosts he'd never lay to rest. He didn't know it yet, but his lonely morning routine was about to be interrupted by a hand reaching up from the water, grasping for life, for hope, for salvation. Jed Cole was about to meet the woman who would remind him why he'd survived when so many others hadn't. But first, Clara May had to survive the night, and the river wasn't done with her yet. Miles downstream, where the current slowed and the water spread wide across a broad, shallow section dotted with sandbars, Clara May's body finally surfaced. She didn't know it. She was unconscious, barely breathing, more dead than alive. But the river, for reasons known only to itself, chose mercy. It carried her gently, now, no longer violent, no longer cruel. It cradled her like a mother might, washing her toward the eastern bank, where the first gray light of dawn was just beginning to touch the water. Her hand broke the surface, first fingers pale and limp trailing in the current, and on the shore filling his canteen in the early morning quiet, a man with gray eyes and old scars stopped cold staring at that hand like it was a ghost, because Jed Cole knew that gesture. He'd seen it before a lifetime ago in a place where boys screamed for help that never came. This time, just this once, maybe help would arrive in time. Jed Cole had stopped believing in signs from God. Around the same time he'd stopped believing in much of anything else, sometime during the 3rd year of the war, when he'd watched a boy no older than 16 bleed out in a Virginia cornfield crying for a mother who'd never hear him. That boy's hand had reached up just like that, pale fingers grasping at nothing, at air, at hope that wouldn't come. Jed had been too far away then, pinned down by Confederate rifle fire, forced to watch as the light left the kid's eyes. But he wasn't pinned down now. He dropped the canteen and ran. The water was shallower here than upstream, maybe waist deep at its deepest, but the current was still strong enough to knock a man off balance if he wasn't careful. Jed didn't care. He crashed into the river, fully clothed, his boots filling with water, his gun belt weighing him down. His eyes were locked on that hand, which had already started to sink again, disappearing beneath the surface like it had never existed. "Hold on," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Just hold on." He reached her in maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like an hour. His hands found fabric, first thin waterlogged cotton that tore the moment he grabbed it. He got an arm around her waist instead, hauling her up, breaking her face through the surface. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, lifeless and heavy. Her lips were blue. Her skin was white as fresh snow. For a terrible moment, Jed thought he was too late. He dragged her toward the shore, his boots slipping on river stones, his breath coming hard. She was lighter than she should be, too light, like she was made of hollow bones and paper skin. When he finally reached the bank, he laid her down in the mud and immediately pressed his ear to her chest. Nothing. No breath. No heartbeat that he could detect over his own hammering pulse. No! The word came out sharp, almost angry. No! You don't get to die. Not after making it this far. He'd done this before during the war. Field medicine, they'd called it, though most of the time it was just desperate men doing desperate things to keep other desperate men alive. He turned her on her side first, letting water drain from her mouth. There was more than he expected gushing out, along with river muck, and what might have been blood. Then he rolled her onto her back again, tilted her head, and started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counted them out loud, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, mouth to mouth just like the army surgeon had taught them before Antietam. He could taste river water on her lips, cold and bitter. Nothing. She didn't respond. He did it again. 30 compressions, he could feel her ribs flexing under his palms, fragile as bird bones. 2 breaths. Her chest rose and fell with his breath, but not with her own. Come on, he growled. Breathe, damn you. Again. Compressions until his arms burned, breaths until his own lungs ached. He was vaguely aware that the sun was coming up now, pale gold light spilling across the water, making her skin look even more corpse-like. In that light, he could see the bruises, dark purple handprints on her arms, a split lip that had bled down her chin, marks around her wrists like she'd been tied up. Something cold and familiar settled in his gut. He knew those kinds of marks. He'd seen them before back in the border states during the war, in houses where the fighting had moved on but the cruelty had stayed behind. He pushed harder on her chest, anger fueling him now. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, and then she coughed. It was a weak, wet sound, barely more than a gurgle, but it was something. Her body convulsed, and more water came up pouring out of her mouth and nose. Jed turned her on her side again, supporting her head as she choked and gasped. Her eyes fluttered, but didn't open. That's it, he said, his voice rough. Get it out, all of it. She coughed again, harder this time, her whole body shaking with the effort. When the worst of it passed, she sucked in a breath, shallow and rattling, but a breath nonetheless. Then another. Her chest was rising and falling on its own now, unsteady but persistent. Jed sat back on his heels, his heart still racing, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. She was alive. Barely, but alive. He looked around quickly, assessing. They were on the eastern bank of the Clearwater, maybe 5 miles downstream from Salvation Creek by his estimation. The nearest town in this direction was Birch Hollow, but that was a good 15 miles north. His own place, a ranch he'd inherited from a man who'd had the good sense to die before the bank could take it, was about 3 miles east up in the foothills. The girl needed shelter. She needed warmth and dry clothes and probably a doctor, though the nearest one was back in Salvation Creek, which meant he'd be handling this himself. He shrugged out of his coat, heavy canvas lined with wool built for mountain winters, and wrapped it around her. She was wearing next to nothing, just thin undergarments that were shredded and barely decent. The coat swallowed her completely. He pulled it tight, and then as gently as he could manage with his war-damaged shoulder lifted her into his arms. She was unconscious again, her head resting against his chest, her breathing weak but steady. Up close he could see she was young, maybe 20, maybe younger. Her hair was dark, tangled with riverweed and mud. Her face might have been pretty once before someone had used it as a punching bag. Jed's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what kind of man left marks like that on a woman. He'd killed a few of them during the war, and he hadn't lost sleep over it. His horse, a gray gelding named Smoke, was grazing about 50 yards upriver where Jed had left him. The animal looked up as Jed approached, ears, forward nostrils flaring at the smell of river water and blood. Easy, Jed murmured. Just got some extra cargo this morning. Getting her onto the horse while she was unconscious was harder than dragging her from the river. She was dead weight limp and unresponsive, and his shoulder was screaming in protest by the time he finally got her settled in front of the saddle. He climbed up behind her, keeping one arm locked around her waist to hold her steady, and took up the reins with his free hand. The ride back to his ranch took the better part of an hour. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and Jed found himself checking her breathing every few minutes, afraid it would stop. But she kept breathing, kept making those small, unconscious sounds that meant her body was fighting to stay alive. The ranch, when it finally came into view, looked exactly like what it was, a place forgotten by time and ambition. The main house was small, just 3 rooms built from lodgepole pine logs that had weathered to silver gray. The barn was in better shape than the house, which said something about Jed's priorities. There was a corral mostly empty since he only kept the 1 horse and a chicken coop that hadn't seen chickens in at least 5 years. He'd bought the place, or rather won it in a card game from a rancher who'd drunk himself into debt 3 years ago, thinking maybe he could make something of it, build a life, find some kind of peace. But peace, he'd discovered, required more than just land and solitude. It required forgetting, and Jed Cole had never figured out how to forget. He dismounted carefully, keeping his arm around the girl, and carried her inside. The house was dark and cool, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the coffee he'd made that morning before going down to the river. He laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the place, and immediately started building up the fire in the stone hearth. Once the flames were going strong, he turned his attention back to her. She was shivering now, which was actually a good sign. It meant her body was trying to warm itself. He found his spare blankets, all 3 of them, and piled them on top of her. Then he heated water in his kettle and dampened a cloth to clean the mud and blood from her face. That's when he got his first real look at the damage. The split lip was obvious, still oozing a little. There was a bruise on her left cheekbone, dark and angry. But it was the marks on her neck that made Jed's hands still finger-shaped bruises, like someone had tried to strangle her. Not recently, maybe a few days ago, but still visible. Still damning. Jesus, he muttered. He cleaned her face as gently as he could, then checked her arms and what he could see of her shoulders without removing the blankets. More bruises. Some fresh, some old, and faded to yellow-green. Whoever had done this hadn't done it just once. This was sustained, deliberate. Jed had seen this kind of thing before, too. In the war, there'd been camps where women were kept used until they broke. He'd liberated one once outside Atlanta, and the women there had looked just like this, hollow-eyed and covered in bruises that told stories their mouths wouldn't. He sat back in his chair, the damp cloth still in his hand, and stared at the girl sleeping in his bed. She'd run from something. That much was obvious. Run hard enough and far enough to risk drowning rather than go back. Which meant whoever she was running from would likely come looking. Jed rubbed his face with his free hand and sighed. He'd sworn after the war that he was done being a soldier, done fighting other people's battles. He'd come out here to the Montana Territory specifically because it was supposed to be empty quiet, a place where a man could disappear if he wanted to badly enough. But looking at this girl, at the bruises and the torn clothes and the way she was curled up under his blankets like she was trying to disappear into them, Jed felt something shift in his chest. Something old and buried that he'd thought was long dead. The war had taught him how to kill. But before the war, his father had taught him something else, that a man protects what's weak. That strength without compassion was just cruelty with better aim. All right, he said quietly to the room, to himself, to whatever god might still be listening. One more fight, just one more. The girl slept through the morning and into the afternoon. Jed checked on her periodically, making sure she was still breathing, still warm. Around noon, he went out to tend to smoke and check his property. Line old habits from the war, always knowing your perimeter, always watching for threats. Everything was quiet. The mountains stood silent against the sky. The wind moved through the grass like whispered secrets. But Jed didn't relax. Quiet didn't mean safe. It never had. He was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard a small sound from inside the house, barely audible over the thunk of his axe. He dropped the tool immediately and headed back inside his hand, instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. She was awake, or trying to be. Her eyes were open. Dark eyes, brown, or maybe hazel. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but they were unfocused, glassy, with fever or shock or both. She was trying to sit up, her movements weak and uncoordinated. Easy, Jed said, keeping his voice low and steady. He'd learned during the war that sudden movements and loud noises could set off men with bad memories. He figured the same applied to women who'd been through hell. Easy now. You're safe. Her eyes found him, and for a moment they went wide with terror. She tried to scramble back, got tangled in the blankets, and nearly fell off the bed. Jed didn't move, didn't approach. He just held his hands up, palms out, showing he wasn't a threat. You're safe, he repeated. Nobody's going to hurt you. I pulled you out of the river this morning. You near about drowned. She stared at him, her chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He could see her trying to process his words, trying to figure out where she was, what had happened. Her hand came up to her throat to those finger-shaped bruises, and she flinched like the memory of them still hurt. Where? Her voice came out as barely a whisper, raw and damaged. Where am I? My ranch, about 3 miles east of the Clearwater. He kept his tone conversational, unthreatening. Name's Jed Cole. I was watering my horse when I saw you in the river. Pulled you out, brought you here. You've been sleeping most of the day. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloging exits, looking for threats. Jed recognized that behavior too. Soldier's instinct. Survival instinct. You're wearing my coat, he added, nodding toward the canvas bundle she was wrapped in. Your clothes were... They didn't survive the river. I've got a spare shirt you can have if you want it. Pants too, though they'll be too big. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, her knuckles white. You didn't? No. He said it firmly, meeting her eyes. I didn't touch you, except to pull you from the river and clean the mud off your face. You've got my word on that. They stared at each other for a long moment. Jed could see her trying to decide whether to believe him, whether to trust him. He didn't blame her for hesitating. A woman who looked like she'd been through what she'd been through had no reason to trust any man. Finally, she spoke again. Why what? Why did you... She struggled to find the words. Why did you save me? Jed considered the question. It was a good one. He'd asked himself the same thing on the ride back to the ranch. Why had he dove into that river? Why had he brought her here instead of just leaving her on the bank for someone else to find? Why was he getting involved in something that was clearly going to bring trouble to his door? Because once, he said slowly, somebody helped me when I needed it, figured I owed the universe one. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough of it. She studied his face, and he let her. He knew what she'd see a man in his early 40s with gray threading through dark hairlines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline where a bayonet had nearly killed him at Fredericksburg. A hard face. A face that had seen things and done things, but hopefully also a face that didn't lie. Whatever she saw, it must have been enough. Some of the tension left her shoulders. I'm Clara, she said quietly. Clara May. Good to meet you, Clara May, though I wish it were under better circumstances. A ghost of a smile flickered across her face and was gone just as quickly. She winced and touched her split lip gingerly. How bad do I look? You look like you went 10 rounds with a grizzly bear and then took a swim in a river that wanted you dead, Jed said honestly. But you're alive, which is more than most people can say after the Clearwater gets hold of them. She closed her eyes, and for a moment her face crumpled like she might cry. But she didn't. She just took a shaky breath and opened her eyes again. I thought I was going to die, she whispered. I was so cold and the water was everywhere and I couldn't breathe. I thought maybe it would be better than... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. You're not going back, Jed said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Her eyes snapped to his, searching. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know who... Don't matter who. You ran from something bad enough that you chose drowning over going back. That tells me everything I need to know. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. You're not going back, Clara May. Not while I'm breathing. Tears spilled down her cheeks, then silent and unstoppable. She covered her face with her hands that were scratched and bruised and shaking, and wept like her soul was breaking open. Jed looked away, giving her what privacy he could in the small room, and busied himself poking at the fire. When she finally quieted, he heard her say something so soft he almost missed it. Thank you. He nodded but didn't turn around. You hungry? I've got some stew from yesterday. It ain't fancy, but it'll fill your stomach. Yes, please. He heated the stew and brought her a bowl along with a tin cup of water. She ate slowly, like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in a long time, and Jed found himself getting angry all over again at whoever had done this to her. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and looked at him directly. "They'll come looking for me," she said. "Tucker Shaw. His men. They'll search downstream and eventually they'll find tracks or ask questions in Birch Hollow. When they do, Jed interrupted, they'll find me, and that'll be their mistake. You don't understand. Tucker Shaw isn't just some rancher or saloon keeper. He owns half of Salvation Creek. He's got maybe a dozen men working for him, all of them mean. He won't let me go. She struggled with the words. I was his property. That's how he sees it, and he don't let his property walk away. Jed's jaw tightened. You're not property, Clara May. You're a person. And no man, I don't care how many guns he's got, owns another person. Not anymore. The law won't help, she said bitterly. Tucker's got the sheriff in his pocket. Hell, the sheriff probably spends more time at the Dusty Rose than he does at his own house. If you turn me in, if you tell anyone I'm here, I'm not turning you in. Jed stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. The sun was getting lower now, painting the peaks gold and orange. But you're right about one thing. They will come looking, which means we need to be ready. He turned to face her. You really think I pulled you out of that river just to hand you back to the men who did that to you? He gestured at her bruises. I fought a war, Clara May. I've seen evil in more forms than I care to remember. And I learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil is to stand in its way and refuse to move. So, yeah, we. She stared at him like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. You don't even know me. Don't need to. I know enough. I can't pay you. I don't have anything. No money, no family, nothing. I didn't ask for payment. Then why? She shook her head, frustration and confusion warring on her face. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? Jed was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. Finally, he said, During the war, I watched a lot of men die. Good men. Men with families and futures and every reason to live. And most of them died for nothing, for a piece of ground that'd be given back the next day, for orders that didn't make sense, for causes that stopped mattering the moment they took their last breath. I survived when better men didn't, and for a long time I didn't know why. Thought maybe it was just dumb luck, random chance. He met her eyes. But maybe it wasn't random. Maybe I survived for a reason. Maybe today that reason was being at that river at exactly the right time to see your hand reaching up from the water. And if that's true, then I'll be damned if I'm going to waste it by doing nothing. Clara May looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Some of the fear fading, replaced by something that might have been hope. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just rest. Get your strength back. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She nodded slowly and settled back against the pillows. The firelight cast shadows across her face, making her look younger than she probably was. Jed. Yeah. That thing you said before. About it hurting. He frowned, confused. I didn't. This morning, when you pulled me out, I heard you. You said, easy, it hurts, or something like that. Or maybe I dreamed it. I don't know. Everything's fuzzy. Jed felt something cold settle in his chest. He hadn't said those words. She had. When he'd first laid her down on the bank, when she'd briefly come to consciousness before passing out again, she'd whispered them, easy. It hurts. It was the same thing a dying soldier had said to him once years ago when Jed had tried to carry him to safety. But he didn't correct her. Instead, he just nodded. Yeah, it hurts. But you're alive, and alive means there's still hope. Remember that. She smiled a real smile this time, small but genuine, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep again, her breathing deep and steady. Jed stood by the window watching the sun sink behind the mountains and wondered what kind of hell was about to come knocking on his door. He didn't have to wait long. The riders came at dawn, 2 days later, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like war drums. Jed heard them before he saw them. 4 men, maybe 5, moving fast through the valley below his property. He was already awake, standing on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the eastern sky bleed pink and gold. He'd learned in the war to trust his instincts, and his instincts had been screaming at him since midnight that trouble was close. Clara May was still sleeping inside, curled up in his bed, while he'd spent another night in the chair by the fire. She was stronger now than she'd been that first day, able to walk without stumbling, able to eat without her hands shaking, but the fear in her eyes hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown sharper as the hours passed, like she was counting down to an inevitable reckoning. Jed set his coffee down on the porch rail and went back inside, moving quietly. He knelt beside the bed and touched her shoulder gently. Clara May, wake up. Her eyes snapped open immediately, already alert, already afraid. What is it? Riders, coming up from the south. Could be nothing but... I don't believe in coincidence. She sat up fast, the color draining from her face. How many? 4 or 5, too far to tell yet. He stood and moved to his gun cabinet, a simple wooden box he'd built himself. Inside were his service revolver from the war, a Colt Army model that had saved his life more times than he could count, along with a newer Peacemaker he'd bought in Helena and a Winchester rifle that had belonged to the previous owner of the ranch. He checked the revolver's cylinder loaded and slipped it into his holster, the rifle he kept in his hands. What are you going to do? Clara May had gotten out of bed, wrapped in one of his old shirts that hung to her knees. Her hair was still tangled, her face still bruised, but there was steel in her voice now. Not surrender? Not yet. Depends on what they want, Jed said. Could be they're just passing through. Ranchers looking for stray cattle. Hunters. You don't believe that any more than I do. He looked at her and saw she was right. No, I don't. Get dressed. Pants and boots, they're by the trunk. If shooting starts, you get out the back window and you run for the tree line. Don't stop, don't look back. Head north toward Birch Hollow. There's a family there, the Andersons. Tell them Jed Cole sent you. They're good people. They'll help. I'm not leaving you here alone. You are, if I tell you to. His voice was harder now, the officer's tone he'd used during the war when there was no time for argument. I can handle myself, but I can't handle them and worry about you at the same time. You understand? She opened her mouth to argue, saw the look on his face, and closed it again. Fine. But if you get yourself killed, I'm going to be really angry. Despite everything, Jed felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. I'll keep that in mind. He went back to the porch and waited. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out details. 4 men, not 5. All armed, all wearing the kind of clothes that said they worked for someone with money, new hats, good boots, gun belts that weren't held together with string and hope. The lead rider was young, maybe mid-20s, with a cocky set to his shoulders that Jed recognized immediately. That was the posture of a man who'd never really been tested, who thought a gun on his hip made him invincible. The war had been full of men like that. Most of them had died in the first year. They pulled up about 30 yards from the house, spreading out in a loose line. The young one urged his horse forward a few more steps and tipped his hat, his smile wide and empty. "Morning, friend," he called out. "Beautiful day, ain't it?" Jed didn't move from his position on the porch, the rifle held casual but ready across his chest. It was. What can I do for you boys? We're looking for someone. A girl, dark hair about this tall. He held his hand up around shoulder height. Goes by the name Clara May. You seen her? Can't say I have. What's she done? The young man's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. She's property of Mr. Tucker Shaw down in Salvation Creek. Ran off a few nights back. Mr. Shaw's real eager to get her back. There's a reward for anyone who helps find her, $50. That's good money for just pointing us in the right direction. $50 is good money, Jed agreed. But I already told you I haven't seen any girl matching that description. River's about 3 miles west if you want to check there. I heard the current's been running fast lately. Could be she tried to cross and didn't make it. One of the other riders, older and meaner looking, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Could be. Could also be someone fished her out and is keeping her to himself. That'd be a problem seeing as she belongs to Mr. Shaw. Jed's grip tightened slightly on the rifle, but his voice stayed level. Let me make sure I understand you correctly. You're telling me a grown woman belongs to a man, like a horse or a piece of furniture. I'm telling you, the young one said, and his smile was gone now. that Mr. Shaw has invested considerable resources in that girl, and he wants his property back. Now we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. You seem like a reasonable man, so I'll ask you one more time. Have you seen her? Inside the house, Jed knew Clara May was listening to every word. He thought about the bruises on her arms, the marks on her throat, the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked why he'd saved her, like she couldn't comprehend basic human decency because it had been beaten out of her world. No, he said simply. I haven't seen her. Now get off my property. The young rider's jaw tightened. Behind him, the other three shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their guns. That's unfortunate. See, we heard from some folks in Birch Hollow that a man matching your description was seen near the river a few days ago, right around the time Clara May would have been running. I water my horse at the river most mornings. Doesn't mean I saw your girl. Mind if we take a look around just to satisfy Mr. Shaw that we did our due diligence? I do mind, actually. This is private property and you boys are trespassing. I've asked you politely to leave. I won't ask again. The older rider leaned forward in his saddle. You threatening us, old man? I'm stating facts. You're on my land without permission. Montana law says I have every right to defend my property against intruders. Now you can leave peacefully, or I can start defending. Your choice. There was a long moment of silence, tense and brittle. The young rider was weighing his options. Jed could see it calculating odds, measuring risks. 4 men against 1. Should be easy odds. But there was something about the way Jed stood there, calm and still, that gave him pause. Veterans had a look about them, a bearing that said they'd been in situations where the stakes were life and death, and they'd come out on the winning side. This was that look. Mr. Shaw's not going to like this, the young one said finally. Mr. Shaw's feelings aren't my concern. They will be. He's not a man who takes kindly to people interfering in his business. Then he and I have something in common, Jed said, because I don't take kindly to people threatening me on my own porch. We done here. The young rider stared at him for another few seconds, then jerked his reins hard, wheeling his horse around. We're done. For now. But you're making a mistake, friend. A big one. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, Jed said. I'm still here. They rode off fast in angry dust, kicking up behind their horses. Jed watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, then waited another 5 minutes to make sure they weren't circling back. Only then did he lower the rifle and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Clara May appeared in the doorway, dressed now in his 2 large pants and a shirt she'd tied at the waist. Her face was pale, but composed. They'll be back. Yes. With more men. Probably. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from something deeper. This is my fault. I shouldn't have let you get involved. I should leave, go somewhere else. Where? Jed turned to look at her. Where are you going to go, Clara May? You've got no money, no horse, no supplies. Tucker Shaw owns Salvation Creek and probably has connections in every town between here and Helena. You'd be caught inside a day. Is that what you want? To go back to him? No. The word came out fierce, almost violent. I'd rather die. Then you stay. We'll figure this out. There's nothing to figure out, she said, and there was despair in her voice now. You heard them. Tucker's not going to stop. He'll come here with all his men, and you'll be 1 man against a dozen, and you'll die because of me. Because I was stupid enough to run, and stupid enough to think I could actually get away. Jed walked over to her and put his hands on her shoulders, firm but gentle. Look at me. When she didn't, he said it again harder. Clara May. Look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and he saw the tears there held back by pure will. You are not stupid, he said clearly. You ran because staying meant slow death. You chose life, and there's nothing stupid about that. And I'm not going to die because I've been through worse than Tucker Shaw and his hired guns. You hear me? You can't know that. I know I've survived a war that killed 600,000 men. I know I've faced artillery and cavalry charges and hand-to-hand fighting in trenches filled with mud and blood. I know I've been shot twice and bayoneted once, and I'm still standing. Tucker Shaw is just a bully with money. I've killed better men than him for threatening less than what he's done to you. Her breath caught. Killed? He let go of her shoulders and stepped back. I was a soldier, Clara May. I did what soldiers do. I don't talk about it much, don't like thinking about it. But yes, I've killed men, a lot of men. And if Tucker Shaw brings his violence to my door, I'll kill him too. Not because I want to, but because some things are worth fighting for, and your life is one of them. She was quiet for a long moment processing this. Finally, she said, I don't understand you. That makes two of us. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Almost. What do we do now? Now we prepare. I've got some work to do around the property things that'll make it harder for anyone to come at us unexpected. You're going to help me. And while we work, you're going to tell me everything you know about Tucker Shaw, how many men he has, how they operate, what weapons they favor. If we're going to stand against them, I need intelligence. She nodded slowly. Okay, but Jed? Yeah. When this is over, if we survive, I'm going to find a way to pay you back. Somehow. He shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Clara May, but we can argue about it later. Right now, we've got work to do. They spent the morning turning Jed's ranch into something that could be defended. He'd done this before during the war, fortifying positions, creating killing fields, planning fallback routes. It was grim work born from hard experience, but it was necessary. He moved his ammunition inside along with extra water and food in case they ended up in a siege situation. He reinforced the door with an extra timber bar. He cleared sight lines from the windows, making sure there was nowhere close to the house where a man could hide without being exposed. Clara May worked alongside him, asking questions, learning. He taught her how to load the Winchester, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. She was a quick study, her hand steady despite the fear he knew was churning inside her. You ever shot a gun before? He asked as she practiced aiming at a tree stump 50 yards out. Once. A customer at the Dusty Rose got too rough with one of the other girls. I took his pistol off the table and pointed it at him. Told him to get out or I'd shoot him. She lowered the rifle, her expression distant. He laughed at me, said I didn't have the nerve, so I pulled the trigger. Jed waited. The gun wasn't loaded, she continued. He'd been smart enough to empty it before he came upstairs. He beat me half to death after that. Broke 2 of my ribs. Tucker didn't care, said I'd brought it on myself by being uppity. She looked at Jed. I swore then that if I ever got another chance, I wouldn't hesitate. And I wouldn't check if the gun was loaded first. Good, Jed said. Hesitation gets you killed. If you point a gun at someone, you better be ready to use it. Otherwise, don't draw it in the first place. They worked through the afternoon until the sun was low and the shadows were long. Jed showed her the escape route he'd planned out the back window through the narrow gap in the rocks behind the barn, then north into the forest. He made her walk it twice, timing her, making sure she could do it in the dark, if necessary. If shooting starts, he told her, you count to 30. That's how long I can hold them. 30 seconds. Then you run. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Just run. You understand? 30 seconds, she repeated. Then run. Good girl. As the sun set, they ate a quiet dinner of beans and cornbread. Clara May had grown quieter as the day wore on, and Jed could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. He understood. Waiting for violence was sometimes harder than the violence itself. At least when the shooting started, you had something to do, something to focus on. But waiting, that gave your imagination time to run wild, to picture all the ways things could go wrong. Tell me about the war, she said, suddenly breaking the silence. Jed looked up from his plate. That's not a good dinner conversation. I don't care. I want to know. You said you survived. How? He was quiet for a moment, debating whether to answer, but maybe she deserved to know what kind of man she'd tied her fate to. I survived by being lucky and mean. Mostly lucky. I enlisted in '61 right after Fort Sumter. Thought it'd be over by Christmas. Thought we'd march down south, teach those rebels a lesson, and be home by spring. He shook his head. I was 22 years old and stupid as a fence post. What happened? What happened was Bull Run, then Antietam, then Fredericksburg, then Gettysburg, then everything else. I watched friends die. I watched strangers die. I watched boys who shouldn't have been soldiers get torn apart by artillery fire. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of myself as a person and started thinking of myself as a weapon, a tool. something that could be pointed at the enemy and expected to kill. He took a drink of water, his throat suddenly dry. I got good at it, real good. Made sergeant, then lieutenant. Got a reputation for being hard but fair, for keeping my men alive longer than most officers. But you know what the secret was? There was no secret, just luck. Random chance. The bullet that killed the man next to me missed me by 6 inches. The shell that blew apart my squad hit after I'd moved position. I survived because other men died. That's all. Clara May was watching him intently. You don't believe that. I can hear it in your voice. You think you survived for a reason. Maybe I want to believe that. Doesn't make it true. What if it is true? What if you survived so you'd be at that river 3 days ago, so you'd save me? Jed met her eyes. Then maybe all those men I watched die weren't for nothing. Maybe their deaths bought my survival, and my survival bought yours. Maybe that's how it works. We all pay forward and backward and hope it balances out in the end. Do you think it does balance out? No, he said honestly, but I keep hoping anyway. They finished dinner in silence, and afterward Clara May helped him clean the dishes. The evening had turned cold the way Montana evenings did, even in late summer, and Jed built up the fire. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, not speaking, just existing in each other's presence. Finally, Clara May said, Jed, thank you for everything, for not giving up on me. You make it sound like that's unusual. In my experience, it is. He wanted to tell her that her experience was broken, that the world wasn't supposed to be like what she'd lived through. But he'd seen enough of the world to know that would be a lie. So instead he just said, You're welcome, Clara May. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She nodded and went to the bed, but Jed knew she wouldn't sleep much. He could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting to the windows. She was waiting for Tucker Shaw's men to come back, waiting for the inevitable. Jed settled into his chair, the revolver loose in his lap, and stared into the fire. He'd told Clara May he'd survived worse than Tucker Shaw, and that was true. But he'd also lost something in that survival, the part of him that could sleep easy, the part that could close his eyes without seeing the faces of the men he'd killed. Maybe this was his chance to get it back. Maybe saving Clara May would balance the scales somehow, would let him sleep without dreams of screaming boys and burning cities. Or maybe he was just a fool with a gun about to get himself killed for a woman he barely knew. Either way, he'd know soon enough. The attack came the next afternoon, fast and brutal. Jed was outside checking the corral when he saw the dust cloud rising from the south 8 riders this time, maybe more. They weren't trying to hide their approach. This was meant to be intimidation, a show of force. He dropped the fence post he'd been setting and ran for the house, his boots pounding the hard earth. Clara May, they're coming. Get the rifle. She was already moving when he burst through the door. The Winchester in her hands, her face pale but determined. Jed grabbed his own rifle and took position at the front window, sighting down the barrel at the approaching riders. 8 men. No 9. Leading them was a man on a black horse, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a white hat and a long coat despite the heat. Even from a distance, Jed could feel the authority radiating from him. Tucker Shaw. Had to be. They pulled up in front of the house, forming a loose semicircle. Tucker Shaw dismounted slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. He was maybe 50 with gray in his beard and eyes like chips of blue ice. He carried himself like a man who'd never been told no in his life. Jed Cole, he called out, his voice smooth and cultured. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jed stood on the porch, rifle ready. Can't imagine what that would be. Tucker smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with warmth or humor. Don't play games with me, son. I know she's in there. Clara May. My girl. She ran away a few nights ago, and I've been very worried about her. I just want to make sure she's safe, that she's being treated properly. Treated properly, Jed repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation. That's rich coming from a man who beats women. Tucker's smile didn't falter. I don't know what lies she's told you, but Clara May is prone to exaggeration. She's had a hard life, and sometimes she gets confused, makes up stories, but she's mine, paid for and legal, and I want her back. She's not property, and she's not going anywhere. Tucker sighed like Jed was being unreasonable. Mr. Cole, I'm trying to handle this civilly, but you're making that difficult. I'm offering you $500 to return her to me. That's more money than you'll see in 5 years on this patch of dirt you call a ranch. Take it. Walk away. Forget you ever saw her. Not interested. Then I'll have to take her by force, and you'll die in the process. Is one whore really worth your life? Jed's finger tightened on the trigger. Call her that again and I'll kill you where you stand. Tucker's eyes narrowed. You're a fool. 9 against 1. You can't win this. Maybe not, but I'll take 3 or 4 of you with me. Maybe more. Question is which 3 or 4 you want to volunteer to go first. How about you? He swung the rifle slightly, pointing at different men in Tucker's line. You look like you've got a family. Wife, kids. They're going to miss you when you don't come home. And you're young. Probably think you're invincible. You'll learn different when my bullet takes you through the chest. Any of you want to die today for Tucker Shaw's pride? Several of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Tucker Shaw might pay well, but dead men couldn't spend money. Jed could see the calculation happening in their heads. Was this worth it? Tucker saw it too. His jaw tightened. Anyone who turns back now is finished. You hear me. Finished. You'll never work in this territory again. One of the younger riders, the same cocky kid from the day before, urged his horse forward. I'll handle this, Mr. Shaw. Old man, don't scare me. Son, Jed said quietly, you really want to do this. Hand her over. The kid said, his hand dropping to his gun. Hand her over, or I'll come in there and get her myself. Last chance, Jed warned. The kid's hand went for his gun. Jed's rifle barked once sharp and final. The bullet caught the kid in the shoulder, spinning him sideways off his horse. He hit the ground hard, screaming, clutching his arm. His gun fell in the dirt unfired. For a moment, nobody moved. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the mountains, then faded into terrible silence. Next one goes through someone's heart, Jed said calmly. Your choice, whose? Tucker Shaw's face had gone dark with rage. You're a dead man, Cole. You and that bitch inside. Maybe, but you'll be dead first, and something tells me you're not ready to die for this. You're too comfortable, too used to getting your way. Men like you don't charge into gunfire. You send other men to do it for you. Tucker stared at him, and Jed could see the truth of it in his eyes. He was right. Tucker Shaw was a coward beneath all the money and power. He'd kill from a distance, from safety, but he wouldn't risk his own skin. This isn't over, Tucker said finally. Not even close. I expect not, but today it is. Now pick up your man and get off my property. 2 of Tucker's men dismounted and dragged the wounded kid back to his horse, then helped him mount up. The kid was still screaming, blood soaking through his shirt. They'd have to ride hard to get him to a doctor before infection set in. Tucker Shaw mounted his black horse and stared at Jed for a long moment. You've made an enemy today, Mr. Cole. A powerful one. I own this territory. I own the law. I own the land and the people on it. And before this is over, I'm going to own your corpse. Looking forward to it, Jed said. They rode off slowly this time, Tucker Shaw looking back once with murder in his eyes. Inside the house, Clara May lowered the rifle, her hand shaking. You shot him. I did. He could have killed you. He could have, but he didn't. Jed set his rifle down and let out a long breath. It's not over, though. Tucker's not going to give up. He'll be back with more men better prepared. We bought ourselves time, that's all. Clara May walked over to him, and before he could react, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. He stood there stiff and awkward, not sure what to do with his hands. It had been a long time since anyone had hugged him. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. Thank you for standing up for me. No one's ever done that before. Slowly, carefully, Jed put his arms around her and held her. You're welcome, Clara May. Now let's get ready. Because Tucker Shaw's not done with us yet, not by a long shot. The silence that followed Tucker Shaw's departure was heavier than the gunshot had been. Clara May finally let go of Jed and stepped back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She wasn't crying exactly, but her face was flushed and her breathing unsteady, like she'd been holding something in for too long and it was finally breaking free. I need to do something, she said abruptly. I can't just sit here waiting for them to come back. I'll go crazy. Jed understood that impulse. After battles, soldiers needed to move to work to do anything that proved they were still alive and functional. All right, the garden's overgrown. Previous owner planted vegetables but never tended them. Most of it's gone to seed, but there might be something salvageable. And the chicken coop needs cleaning if we're ever going to get birds in there again. She nodded quickly, grateful for the task. I can do that. I used to help my mother with the garden when I was little, before... She didn't finish the sentence, but Jed could fill in the blanks. Before her mother died, before whatever circumstances had led a young girl from Ohio to a Montana brothel. Tools are in the barn, he said, but Clara May don't go beyond the fence line, and if you hear anything at all, you get back to the house immediately. Understand? I understand. She went outside and Jed watched from the window as she made her way to the barn. She moved differently now than she had 3 days ago, still cautious, still wounded, but with something resembling purpose in her steps. He'd seen that transformation before in soldiers who'd survived their first real battle. The fear didn't go away, but it got channeled into something useful, something that kept you moving forward instead of paralyzed. He spent the next hour reinforcing the house's defenses. He moved furniture to create better cover positions. He filled buckets with water and placed them strategically in case of fire. Tucker Shaw struck him as the kind of man who'd burn down a house if he couldn't take it by force. He checked his ammunition again, counting rounds, making sure everything was accessible. 47 bullets for the Winchester, 18 for the Peacemaker, 12 for his old Army Colt. Not enough for a prolonged siege, but enough to make Tucker Shaw's next attempt expensive. Through the window, he could see Clara May working in the garden. She'd found a hoe in the barn and was attacking the weeds with focused intensity, her movements sharp and angry. Good. Anger was better than fear. Anger kept you alive. Around noon, he went out to check on her. The garden was looking better. She'd cleared a significant section and had even found some late-season tomatoes still clinging to life on withered vines. She'd made a pile of them near the fence along with some wild onions and what looked like carrots. Found more than I expected, she said when she saw him approaching. There was dirt on her face and under her fingernails, and her borrowed shirt was dark with sweat. She looked more alive than she had since he'd pulled her from the river. The previous owner knew what they were doing. This soil is good. With some work, you could have a real garden here. I'm not much of a gardener, Jed admitted. My talents lie in other directions. Like shooting people. He expected her to say it with fear or judgment, but there was just honest curiosity in her voice. Like surviving, he corrected. Shooting people is just a tool toward that end. Not something I'm proud of, just something I'm good at. She wiped her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt. My father used to say that every man has a purpose. Some men are meant to build things, some are meant to create things, and some are meant to protect things. She looked at him directly. Maybe you're the third kind. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to know when to quit. She smiled at that, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger, less haunted. I'm starting to think stubborn is a good quality to have out here. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon. Jed helped her carry water from the well for the garden, and she helped him check the barn for structural weak points. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, the kind that comes from shared purpose. When the sun started to dip toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, they went back inside. Clara May cooked dinner using the vegetables she'd salvaged, a stew that was surprisingly good, seasoned with wild herbs she'd recognized growing near the fence line. As they ate, Jed found himself relaxing slightly, letting his guard down just a fraction. This was what peace felt like, he realized. Not the absence of danger, but moments of normalcy stolen between threats. This was what he'd been searching for since the war ended, and he'd never quite found it living alone. Can I ask you something? Clara May said, breaking the quiet. Go ahead. Why didn't you marry after the war, I mean? Seems like a man with land and a house would have no trouble finding a wife. Jed was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. I thought about it. Even courted a woman in Denver for a while, right after I came out here. Sarah, her name was. Nice woman. Worked in a dry goods store. We got along well enough. What happened? I woke up one night screaming. Dreaming about Fredericksburg, the battle, the bodies piled so high you couldn't see the ground. Sarah tried to comfort me, and I didn't know where I was. Thought she was a Confederate soldier. Nearly hurt her before I came back to myself. He stared at his plate. I left that night, wrote her a letter explaining I wasn't fit for marriage, that I'd come back broken from the war and couldn't ask her to live with that. Clara May was quiet for a long moment. Do you still have the dreams? Sometimes. Less than I used to, but they're always there waiting. He looked at her. What about you? You ever think about marriage? A normal life? Her laugh was bitter. Normal life wasn't ever an option for me. My mother died when I was 12. Father drank himself to death a year later, left me with debts I couldn't pay. I had a choice, orphanage or work. I chose work. Thought I was so smart, so capable. I could take care of myself. She shook her head. I was a fool. First job was in a restaurant in Cleveland. Owner seemed nice enough, until he started coming around at night making suggestions. When I refused, he fired me, said I'd been stealing. Suddenly I couldn't get work anywhere in town. That's when Tucker Shaw's recruiter found me. Recruiter. Jed repeated the word, leaving a bad taste in his mouth. That's what they call themselves. Men who travel around looking for desperate girls. They promise good jobs out west, housekeeping, cooking, respectable work. They pay for the train ticket, the food. By the time you arrive, you owe them so much money you can never pay it back. And then they tell you what the real job is. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. I was 15 years old when I got to Salvation Creek. Tucker Shaw told me I owed him $3,000, that I'd work at the Dusty Rose until the debt was paid. He said most girls worked it off in 3 years. But there were always fines. For breaking rules, for talking back, for refusing customers. The debt never got smaller, it only grew. Jed felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. During the war, he'd seen similar systems, plantation owners who claimed their slaves owed them for food and shelter, criminals who kept people trapped through manufactured debt. He'd thought naively that the war had ended such things, but evil didn't die. It just found new forms. How long were you there? He asked quietly. 3 years. 3 years of hell. Some of the girls didn't make it that long. Mary Ellen hung herself in her room last winter, Sarah different. Sarah died from a beating that got too rough. Tucker paid off the sheriff, said she'd had an accident. Nobody questioned it. Nobody cared. We were just whores. Disposable. You're not disposable, Clara May. You're a person who deserves respect and dignity and every damn thing Tucker Shaw stole from you. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he saw tears threatening again. Why do you care so much? You barely know me. Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. During the war, I watched towns get burned. I watched families torn apart. I watched men commit atrocities and justify it with talk of necessity and strategy. And afterward, I swore that if I ever had a chance to stand against that kind of evil again, I would. Not for glory. Not for recognition. Just because it's the right thing to do. You're a better man than most I've met. I'm just a man, Clara May. Nothing special. I've done bad things, killed people who probably didn't deserve it, made mistakes that haunt me. But I'm trying in my own broken way to balance the scales. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her palm was rough from the day's work, her fingers small against his. Thank you, Jed, for trying, for caring, for being here when I needed someone. He squeezed her hand gently, then let go and stood. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. Tucker's going to be planning his next move, and we need to be ready. Do you think he'll attack tonight? No, he'll wait. Let us stew in fear, try to wear us down psychologically before he comes back physically. It's what I do. That's comforting, she said dryly. Wasn't meant to be comforting, was meant to be honest. He checked the door's barricade one more time, then looked at her. You take the bed again. I'll watch from the chair. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. You need rest too. I've gone longer without sleep during the war. I'll be fine. Jed. She stood and walked over to him. The bed's big enough for 2 people. We're both adults. We can share it without... She trailed off, but he understood what she was saying. He wanted to refuse to maintain the careful distance he'd established. The truth was, he was exhausted. His shoulder ached from old wounds. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. And she was right. They were adults who could share a space without impropriety. All right, he said finally, but I'm keeping the gun close. They settled on opposite sides of the bed, both fully clothed, a careful gap between them. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. Jed lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of Clara May's breathing beside him. "Jed," her voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah, I'm scared. I know. But I'm also, I don't know how to describe it. Angry, determined. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have some control over my life. Even with Tucker Shaw threatening to kill us both, even with everything that's happened, I feel more free now than I did in that safe locked room at the Dusty Rose. That's not safety you were feeling there. That was captivity. There's a difference. I know that now." She was quiet for a moment. "If we survive this, what happens? Then where do I go?" "You stay here," Jed said simply. "Work the ranch with me. Build that garden you were talking about. Live your life the way you want to live it, not the way someone else forces you to. You'd let me stay after everything. Clara May, there's no let about it. This is your home now if you want it to be. No strings attached, no debts, just two people trying to make a go of it in a hard land." He heard her breath catch, heard the rustle of blankets as she moved. Then he felt her hand find his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me hope again." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just squeezed her hand and held on. Eventually, her breathing evened out, and he knew she was asleep. Jed lay awake longer, his mind running through scenarios, planning contingencies, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. But for the first time in years, the dreams didn't come. He slept deeply and dreamlessly. Clara May's hand still clasped in his own. He woke to the sound of horses. It was still dark outside, that dead hour before dawn when the world holds its breath. Jed was on his feet instantly, gun in hand, moving to the window. Clara May sat up behind him, alert and afraid. "How many?" she whispered. Jed counted silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. 6. Maybe 7. They're staying back out of rifle range. What are they doing? That's when Jed smelled it. Smoke. "The barn," he said, already moving toward the door. "They're burning the barn." Clara May grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there. That's what they want. They want you outside exposed." She was right. This was tactical, designed to draw him out, to separate him from his fortified position. Jed forced himself to think, to calculate. The barn was old wood, dry as kindling. It would burn fast and hot, but there was nothing in there worth dying for. No animals, no irreplaceable equipment. Let it burn. Stay inside. Stay safe. Except Smoke was in the corral attached to the barn. His horse. His companion for 3 years. The animal that had carried him through storms and heat and never complained. Jed could hear him now screaming in fear as the flames grew brighter. "Damn it," he muttered. "Jed, no. It's a trap. I know it's a trap, but I'm not letting them burn my horse alive." He checked his revolver, made sure it was loaded. "You stay here. Keep the rifle ready. If anyone comes near the house, shoot them. You'll die out there." "Maybe, but I've got to try." He looked at her, memorizing her face in case this was the last time. "If I don't make it back, you run. North to the Andersons. Don't stop. Don't look back. Promise me." "I promise," she said, but he could see the lie in her eyes. She wouldn't run. She'd fight, die if necessary, rather than go back to Tucker Shaw. Jed slipped out the back window, moving low and fast through the pre-dawn darkness. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet high, casting everything in hellish orange light. He could see the riders more clearly now. They'd moved closer, confident that the fire would flush him out. They were right. He made it to the corral fence and vaulted over. Smoke was pressed against the far corner, eyes rolling white with terror. The fire was spreading to the corral posts, and soon the whole structure would collapse. "Easy, boy," Jed murmured, approaching slowly. "Easy. I've got you." The horse recognized his voice and stopped thrashing. Jed got a hand on his halter and led him toward the gate. That's when the shooting started. Bullets whined past his head, thunked into wood, sang off rocks. Jed dropped low, using Smoke's body as cover. Not ideal, but better than nothing. He fired back blindly with his revolver just to make them keep their heads down and kept moving toward the gate. He got it open and slapped Smoke's hindquarters. "Go get!" The horse bolted into the darkness, away from the fire, away from the gunfire. One less thing to worry about. Jed turned his attention to the shooters. They were silhouettes against the burning barn, 5 of them spread out in a loose line. He took careful aim and fired twice. One man screamed and went down. The others scattered, looking for cover. That's when Jed heard the rifle shot from the house, sharp and clear. One of the riders jerked and fell from his horse. Clara May shooting from the front window, protecting him even though he'd told her to stay put. Stubborn woman. He was going to have words with her about following orders, if they survived. He ran for the house, zigzagging, making himself a difficult target. More gunfire erupted around him, kicking up dirt, sparking off stones. Something tugged at his sleeve, a bullet passing too close. He didn't slow down. The porch was 10 yards away, 5 yards. He dove the last few feet and crashed through the door just as Clara May slammed it shut behind him. "You're insane," she said, helping him up. "Completely insane." "So I've been told." He was breathing hard, his heart hammering. "Nice shot out there." "I told you I wouldn't hesitate next time." She handed him the rifle. "There's still 4 of them out there, maybe 5. I think I only wounded 1. Jed moved to the window and assessed the situation. The barn was collapsing now, sending up showers of sparks. The surviving riders had pulled back, regrouping. They'd learned that this wasn't going to be easy, that Jed wasn't some farmer who'd fold at the first sign of violence. "They're going to wait for daylight," he said. "Try to pick us off from a distance. We need to—" He was interrupted by a shout from outside, a familiar voice, smooth and cultured even when raised in anger. "Cole. Jed, Cole, I want to talk." Tucker Shaw had come to supervise personally. Interesting. That meant he was either very confident or very angry. Probably both. "I've got nothing to say to you, Shaw," Jed called back. "Then just listen. Here's how this is going to end. You give me Clara May right now, and I'll let you live. You can keep your little ranch. I'll even compensate you for the barn. We'll call it even and go our separate ways." "Not happening." "Then you'll both die. My men have this place surrounded. You can't escape. You can't win. Best case scenario, you hold out for a few days until you run out of food and water. Worst case, I burn the house down around you tonight. Either way, you die, and I get what I came for. So why not save yourself the suffering? Give her up. She's not worth dying for." Jed looked at Clara May. She was standing against the wall, rifle clutched in her hands, her face pale but determined. In the firelight from the burning barn, he could see the bruises on her face, the marks on her neck. He thought about what she'd told him, 3 years of captivity, of abuse, of being treated like property. "She's worth everything," he called back. There was a long pause. Then Tucker Shaw laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're a fool, Cole. A romantic fool living in the wrong century. This is the West. Power and money rule here, not noble sentiments. I have both. You have neither. This ends only one way. Then I guess we'll find out who's right. So be it. When you're watching her burn, when you're dying slow from a gut shot, remember I gave you a choice. You chose this." The voice retreated, and Jed heard horses moving, taking up positions around the property. They were settling in for a siege. Clara May moved to stand beside him at the window. "He's right, you know," she said quietly. "You could still give me up. Save yourself. I wouldn't blame you." "I would." Jed checked his ammunition again. "Besides, I made you a promise. Nobody hurts you again. I meant it. Even if it costs you everything. Especially then." He looked at her. "Clara May, I spent 4 years in a war killing people I didn't know for reasons that made less sense every day. If I die tomorrow, at least I'll die for something I believe in. For someone who deserves better than what this world gave her. That's a death I can live with. No pun intended." She made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and leaned against his shoulder. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the craziest. Why not both?" They stood together watching the barn burn down to embers, watching Tucker Shaw's men take up positions in the darkness, and waited for the sun to rise on what might be their last day alive. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, like it knew what was waiting. The sky bled from black to gray to pale gold, and with the light came clarity. Jed could see Tucker Shaw's men, now 6 of them, positioned in a loose perimeter around the house. 2 behind rocks to the south, 2 in a shallow gully to the east, 2 more in the tree line to the west. They'd left the north side less defended, probably assuming that's where he'd try to run if he made a break for it. Classic mistake. Never leave an obvious escape route unless you're planning an ambush along it, which meant Tucker Shaw definitely had men waiting in those northern woods. Smart bastard, Jed muttered, scanning the terrain through the window. Clara May had made coffee somehow, using the last of his grounds and water she'd heated over the fireplace. She brought him a cup, and the smell alone was enough to make him feel more human. He took it gratefully, letting the heat seep into his hands. "How long can we hold out?" she asked. "Depends on what they do. If they're patient, just keep us pinned down. We've got maybe 3 days of water. Food's not an issue. I've got enough beans and jerky to last a week. But water's the problem. That and ammunition. I've got enough bullets to make them pay for every inch, but eventually I'll run dry. So 3 days. Then what? Then we get creative." He sipped the coffee, strong and bitter, exactly what he needed. "But I don't think it'll come to that. Tucker Shaw doesn't strike me as a patient man. He'll try something today. Something big." He was right. Around mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to burn off the last of the cool morning air, one of Shaw's men stood up behind the rocks to the south and started waving a white cloth tied to a stick. Jed watched him through the rifle sight finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Mr. Cole," the man called out. "Mr. Shaw wants to negotiate. He's willing to talk terms." "I already told him my terms," Jed shouted back. "Leave and never come back. He's prepared to offer you $1,000 cash money just for an hour of your time to discuss this situation." Jed snorted. "An hour of my time so his men can surround the house while I'm distracted. I wasn't born yesterday." "Mr. Shaw gives his word as a gentleman that no harm will come to you during the negotiation." "His word as a gentleman," Jed repeated to Clara May. "Man who beats women and burns down barns wants me to trust his word." "Don't do it," she said immediately. "It's a trap. It has to be." "I know it's a trap. Question is what kind." He thought for a moment, then called out, "Tell Shaw I'll negotiate, but not here. Have him meet me halfway between the house and those rocks he's hiding behind. Just him. No weapons, and if I see any of his men moving during the talk, I'll put a bullet through his skull." There was a long pause while the message was relayed. Then Tucker Shaw himself stood up from behind the rocks, his white hat visible even at this distance. He started walking toward the house, hands raised to show they were empty. Jed watched him come, counting his steps, calculating angles and distances. "What are you doing?" Clara May asked, alarmed. "You're not actually going out there." "I am, but not for the reason he thinks." Jed grabbed his rifle and checked the load one more time. "I need to see his face when I tell him no. Need to read him, figure out what he's really planning. You can learn a lot about a man's next move by watching his eyes when he's angry. Or you could get shot. That's always a possibility." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to her. "Clara May, if something happens to me out there, if this goes bad, you don't try to save me. You understand? You run. Get to that back window and run for the tree line. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You will, if I tell you to. That's an order." "I don't take orders from you," she said, lifting her chin. "I'm not your soldier. I'm not your property. I'm a free woman, and I make my own choices. If you walk out that door and they shoot you, I'm going to shoot back. And if they kill you, I'm going to kill as many of them as I can before they take me. That's my choice." Jed stared at her, seeing the steel in her spine, the fire in her eyes. This wasn't the broken, terrified woman he'd pulled from the river. This was someone who'd found her strength again, who'd remembered she was more than what had been done to her. "You're a hell of a woman, Clara May," he said quietly. "And you're stalling. Go talk to Tucker Shaw before he gets suspicious." Jed opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually, but ready. Tucker Shaw was halfway between the rocks and the house, now standing in the open with his hands still raised. He was smiling, confident, like this was all going according to plan. Jed walked down from the porch and met him in the middle of the clearing, staying well out of arm's reach. Up close, Tucker Shaw was older than he'd looked from a distance. Mid-50s probably, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He was well-dressed, his clothes expensive, his boots polished despite the dust. Everything about him screamed money and power, and the kind of entitlement that came from never being told no. "Mr. Cole," Tucker said warmly, like they were old friends meeting for drinks. "I'm glad you agreed to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I'm hoping we can reach an understanding." "The only understanding we need is that you're leaving and never coming back." Tucker's smile didn't waver. "I admire your loyalty truly. Clara May must be quite something to inspire such devotion in a stranger. But let's be realistic. You're one man. I have 6 men here and a dozen more I can call in from Salvation Creek. You can't win this fight." "I don't need to win. I just need to make it expensive enough that you decide she's not worth it." But that's where you're wrong." Tucker's voice dropped, losing its friendly tone. "This stopped being about Clara May the moment you shot my man. Now it's about respect, about showing everyone in this territory what happens when someone defies Tucker Shaw. If I let you get away with this, if I let a woman escape without consequences, every girl in the Dusty Rose will think she can do the same. I can't allow that. So you see, Mr. Cole, this isn't about money anymore. It's about principle." "Principle," Jed repeated. "That's an interesting word coming from a man who sells human beings." Tucker's eyes went cold. "I provide a service. Those girls come to me desperate and destitute. I give them food, shelter, protection. What they do to earn their keep is their choice. With debts that never decrease and violence waiting if they refuse. That's not choice. That's slavery with extra steps. Call it what you want. The law's on my side. I have contracts, legal documents. Clara May signed her agreement willingly. She belongs to me until her debt is paid." Jed's finger tightened on the rifle. "She belongs to herself. Always has. And no piece of paper changes that." Tucker studied him for a long moment, and Jed saw calculation happening behind those cold blue eyes. "You were in the war, weren't you? I can always tell. Something about the way you stand, the way you hold that rifle. Which side?" "Union. 3rd Corps Army of the Potomac." "Ah, a true believer in the cause of freedom." Tucker's smile returned mocking now. "Tell me, Mr. Cole, did the slaves you freed thank you? Did they write you letters of gratitude, or did they drift off into poverty and starvation because nobody wanted to hire them?" "The war's been over 20 years. How many of those freed slaves do you think are actually better off now? More than were better off in chains." "Are you sure about that? At least in slavery they had food and shelter. Now they're free to starve, free to freeze, free to die in ditches with nobody caring. Is that the freedom you fought for?" Jed felt old anger rising, the kind that had fueled him through 4 years of killing. "I fought because keeping human beings as property is evil. Simple as that. Doesn't matter what comes after. The fundamental wrong needed to end." "How noble," Tucker's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And look where that nobility got you alone on a failing ranch about to die for a whore who'll probably go running back to the first man who offers her a warm meal. You think she cares about you? You think she'll remember you fondly when she's back in Salvation Creek, back in my bed, paying off her debt the way she was always meant to? She's not going back to you. Not ever. We'll see." Tucker glanced at the house, then back at Jed. "Last chance, Mr. Cole. $1,000 in your life, or death and nothing. Choose." "I already chose." Tucker nodded slowly like he'd expected this answer. "Then you're a fool, and you'll die a fool's death." He turned and started walking back toward the rocks. His hands no longer raised, his posture relaxed, like the negotiation had gone exactly as he'd planned. That's when Jed realized the real purpose of the talk. Tucker Shaw hadn't come out here to negotiate. He'd come out here to keep Jed's attention focused forward while his men moved into new positions, while they got closer to the house, while they prepared whatever assault he'd been planning. Jed spun around, already running for the porch. "Clara May, get down!" The windows exploded inward as gunfire erupted from both sides of the house. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Clara May hit the floor, the rifle clattering from her hands. Jed vaulted onto the porch and crashed through the door just as bullets chewed into the frame where his head had been a moment before. "You hit," he shouted, crawling toward her across the floor. "No, I'm okay." She scrambled for the rifle, her hands shaking but her face set with determination. They came from the west side through the trees. I didn't see them until... Not your fault. They used me as a distraction. Jed crawled to the south window and risked a quick look. Tucker Shaw's men were advancing now, moving from cover to cover, using suppressing fire to keep them pinned down. Professional tactics. These weren't just cowboys and ranch hands. Shaw had hired real gunmen. "We can't hold them off," Clara May said, stating the obvious. "There's too many of them, too many angles of attack." She was right. The house had been defensible when the attackers were at a distance, but now they were close within 50 feet on three sides. In another few minutes, they'd be at the walls, and then it would be over. Jed's mind raced sorting through options. They couldn't stay here. But running meant exposing themselves, making themselves easy targets. Unless... "The root cellar," he said suddenly, "under the kitchen. There's a tunnel previous owner dug it during the Indian Wars, back when raids were common. It comes up about 100 yards north inside the tree line. Will it hold both of us?" "It'll have to." He moved to the kitchen area, shoving aside a rug to reveal a trap door. "Grab what ammunition you can carry. We've got maybe 60 seconds before they realize we're not shooting back." Clara May scooped up bullets, shoving them into her pockets. Jed pulled open the trap door, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The smell of damp earth wafted up along with something else, the scent of old fear, old desperate survival. "You first," he said. "I'll cover our retreat." She didn't argue, just climbed down quickly. Jed fired 3 quick shots out the window, not aiming at anything specific, just making noise, making them think the house was still defended, then followed her down, pulling the trapdoor shut above him. The tunnel was narrow and low, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. They had to move in a crouch sometimes, on hands and knees, feeling their way through the darkness. Behind them, Jed could hear shouting as Tucker Shaw's men realized the house was empty. Then gunfire, lots of it, as they shot through walls and windows, making sure nobody was hiding. "Keep moving," Jed urged, pushing Clara May forward. "Don't stop for anything." The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but it was probably only 2 minutes before Clara May's hand found another ladder. Jed climbed up beside her and listened carefully. He could hear voices outside, but distant back toward the house. Slowly, carefully, he pushed open the wooden cover disguised to look like natural forest floor and peered out. They were in thick pines, maybe 15 feet from a game trail, no one in sight. He climbed out and pulled Clara May up after him, then carefully closed the cover and scattered pine needles over it. With luck, Shaw's men wouldn't find it for hours. "Which way?" Clara May whispered. Jed oriented himself by the sun, then pointed northeast. "That way. The Andersons' place is about 8 miles. If we move fast and quiet, we can make it by afternoon." They started moving through the forest, staying off trails, keeping to the thick undergrowth where their passage wouldn't be obvious. Behind them, gunfire still echoed as Tucker Shaw's men ransacked the house, searching for bodies for proof of their victory. They'd walked maybe half a mile when they heard horses crashing through the brush behind them, riders spreading out searching. Shaw had realized his mistake and sent men after them. Jed grabbed Clara May's hand and pulled her down into a small ravine, pressing close to the earth, barely breathing. 2 riders passed within 20 feet, close enough that Jed could hear their conversation. "They can't have gotten far on foot." "Shaw's furious, says he wants them alive if possible, dead if necessary. But alive is better." "Why alive?" "Because he wants Cole to watch what he does to the girl, wants to make an example." They moved on, and Jed felt Clara May trembling beside him. Not from fear, he realized, but from rage. She was gripping her rifle so hard her knuckles had gone white. "Easy," he whispered. "Not yet. We pick our moment." They waited another 10 minutes until the forest went quiet, then continued moving northeast. The terrain was rough here, all steep hillsides and rocky outcroppings, but that worked in their favor. Horses couldn't navigate this ground easily, which meant Shaw's men would have to dismount and search on foot. Slower, more vulnerable. Around noon, they stopped at a small stream to rest and drink. Clara May splashed water on her face, then sat back against a tree exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the reality of their situation. "We can't run forever," she said. "Eventually they'll catch us or wear us down." "I know." So what do we do? Jed had been thinking about this for the last hour, turning over options, weighing risks. We turn it around, stop being hunted, and become hunters. There's 6 of them, maybe 7 if Shaw's out here himself. They'll split up to cover more ground. That means small groups, 2 or 3 men at most. We pick them off one at a time. Even the odds. That's insane. We're outnumbered and outgunned. We've also got surprise and motivation. They're hunting us for money and pride. We're fighting for our lives. That gives us an edge. She studied his face, and whatever she saw there must have convinced her. All right, what's the plan? The plan was simple and brutal. They backtracked along their own trail, moving slowly and carefully until they found a good ambush point, a narrow gap between 2 rock formations where anyone tracking them would have to pass through single file. Jed positioned Clara May on one side with the rifle himself on the other with his revolver. Then they waited. The first 2 riders came through about 20 minutes later, heads down reading tracks. They never saw it coming. Clara May's rifle shot took one in the chest, and Jed's revolver dropped the other before he could even reach for his gun. Quick, clean, no different than 100 ambushes Jed had set during the war. But this time watching the men fall, he felt something different. Not satisfaction or grim necessity, just emptiness. Like he was going through motions he'd learned too well and couldn't forget. 2 down, Clara May said, her voice steady. 4 to go. They moved the bodies off the trail and took their ammunition, 12 more bullets for Jed's peacemaker. Then they relocated, finding a new ambush point a mile to the east. When you set an ambush, you never use the same spot twice. That was basic tactics. The next group was 3 men, and they were more cautious, more alert. They'd probably heard the gunshots and were expecting trouble. Jed let them pass through the killing ground, then shot the rear man in the back. The other 2 spun around, and Clara May's rifle barked twice. One went down. The other made it to cover behind a tree and started returning fire. "Keep him pinned," Jed shouted, circling wide through the brush. He came up on the man's flank and put 2 rounds center mass. The gunman dropped without a sound. 5 down. Maybe 1 or 2 left, plus Tucker Shaw himself. "This is working," Clara May said, reloading with shaking hands. "We're actually doing this." "Don't get confident. Confidence gets you killed. Shaw's going to realize what's happening soon, and he'll either run or come at us with everything he's got." As if summoned by his words, they heard a voice echoing through the forest. Tucker Shaw's voice amplified by rage and desperation. "Cole, I know you can hear me. This is your last chance. Come out now and I'll make it quick. Keep hiding and I'll spend days killing that girl. You hear me? Days." Jed met Clara May's eyes. "He's close, maybe 300 yards south, and he's scared. That's good." "How is that good?" "Scared men make mistakes." He checked his ammunition. 8 rounds left in the peacemaker. 4 in the rifle. Not much, but enough. "Come on, let's end this." They moved south toward Shaw's voice, using every bit of cover the forest provided. The sun was lower now, slanting through the trees at sharp angles, creating pockets of shadow and light. Jed caught movement ahead, 2 figures, one tall and one mounted. Tucker Shaw and his last remaining man standing in a small clearing. Shaw was holding a pistol, waving it around as he shouted, "You're a dead man, Cole. You and that whore both. Nobody crosses Tucker Shaw. Nobody." The man beside him looked nervous, his head swiveling, searching the trees. Smart. He knew they were being hunted now. Jed signaled to Clara May, pointing to his eyes, then to Shaw. She nodded, understanding. They split up, moving to opposite sides of the clearing, creating a crossfire. This was it. The end, one way or another. Jed found a good position behind a fallen log, maybe 40 yards from Shaw, close enough for an accurate shot. He settled the rifle against his shoulder, sighted down the barrel, put Shaw's chest in the middle of his sight picture. One squeeze of the trigger, and this would be over. But something made him hesitate. Not mercy, not second thoughts. Just a memory, standing in a Virginia field after Fredericksburg, surrounded by bodies, wondering if killing got easier or if he just got better at pretending it didn't hurt. He'd sworn after the war that he was done killing, that he'd put the soldier aside and just be a man again. So much for that promise. "Shaw," he called out, keeping the rifle trained on the man's chest. "It's over. Your men are dead. Drop the gun and ride out of here. Last chance." Shaw spun toward his voice, bringing his pistol up. "Show yourself, coward! I'm giving you an out. Take it or don't. But if you make me kill you, I will." Shaw's face twisted with rage. "Kill me. You think you can kill me? I own this territory. I own the law. I own." Jed never found out what else Tucker Shaw owned because Clara May's rifle cracked from the other side of the clearing and Shaw's remaining gunman dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Shaw's eyes went wide with shock and fear. He spun firing blindly into the trees where Clara May's shot had come from. Jed didn't hesitate this time. His rifle spoke once, and Tucker Shaw staggered backward, the pistol falling from his hand. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then up at the trees where Jed was hidden. His mouth moved, trying to form words, but nothing came out except blood. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, and was still. The forest went silent except for the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. Jed stood slowly, the rifle still ready, watching for movement. Nothing. Clara May emerged from the other side of the clearing, her face pale but composed. They met in the middle, stepping over Tucker Shaw's body, and looked at each other. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "It's over." She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days, then slowly sank to her knees. Not crying, not celebrating, just releasing all the tension that had been holding her upright. Jed sat down beside her, suddenly exhausted, his old war wounds aching like they always did after combat. They sat there for a long time, two broken people in a forest full of bodies, wondering what came next. Eventually, Clara May spoke. "What do we do now?" Jed looked at the sun, calculating time and distance. "We find their horses. Take what supplies they have. Then we go to the Andersons' place and clean up. Tomorrow we ride into Salvation Creek and file a complaint with the territorial marshal, the one Shaw didn't own. We tell them what happened, self-defense. They'll probably believe us, especially when we tell them about the girls at the Dusty Rose." "You think anyone will care about girls like me?" "I think times are changing, slowly, but changing. And even if they don't care enough to shut Shaw's operation down, at least the man running it is dead. That's something." "What about your ranch? Shaw's men burned your barn." "I'll rebuild. It's just wood and nails. Nothing I can't fix." He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, let's get out of this forest. I've seen enough death for one day." She took his hand and let him pull her up. "Jed, yeah. Thank you. For everything. For not giving up on me. For fighting when you could have walked away. For—" her voice cracked. "For treating me like I mattered. You do matter, Clara May. Never doubt that." They walked out of that blood-soaked clearing together, leaving Tucker Shaw and his men for the scavengers. It wasn't noble or clean or anything like the war stories Jed had heard as a boy. It was ugly and hard and stained with violence that would probably haunt them both. But it was survival. And sometimes in the West, survival was all you could ask for. 3 weeks later, Jed stood on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains, a cup of coffee in his hand, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber in the air. The new barn was half-built, the frame rising skeletal but promising against the sky. It would be better than the old one when it was finished. Everything seemed to be better lately. The territorial marshal had come, investigated, and ruled the killings justified. Tucker Shaw's criminal enterprise had been exposed, and the girls from the Dusty Rose had been offered safe passage to wherever they wanted to go. Some took it. Some stayed trying to make a life in Salvation Creek, despite everything that had happened there. Jed didn't judge either choice. Survival took different forms for different people. Clara May was in the garden tending to the late-season vegetables she'd coaxed back to life. She'd thrown herself into the work with fierce determination, like she was trying to prove something to herself, to him, to the world. That she was more than what had been done to her. That she could build as well as survive. Watching her now, Jed felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Not quite peace, he'd probably never have that, not with all the ghosts he carried, but something close, something like hope. She looked up, caught him watching, and smiled. A real smile, open and genuine, the kind that transformed her whole face. She'd put on weight in the last few weeks, her cheeks filling out her body, losing that desperate thinness. She looked healthy. She looked alive. "You going to help with this?" she called out, "or just stand there looking philosophical?" "I like philosophical. It suits me." "You know what would suit you better? A shovel and some actual work." Jed laughed. Actually laughed, something he couldn't remember doing since before the war. "Yes, ma'am." "On my way, ma'am." He set down his coffee and walked toward the garden, toward Clara May, toward whatever future they were building together in this hard land. Behind him, the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and fire. The wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like whispered promises. The West was still dangerous, still hard, still full of men like Tucker Shaw and violence like what they'd survived. But it was also full of possibility, of second chances, of people who'd been broken finding ways to heal. As Jed picked up a shovel and started working beside Clara May, turning soil that would feed them through the coming winter, he thought about courage. Real courage. Not the kind that came from a gun or a willingness to fight. The kind that came from getting back up when the world tried to drown you. The kind that Clara May had shown when she chose the river over captivity. The kind she showed now every day by choosing to live instead of just survive. "Hey, Jed," she said, breaking into his thoughts. "Yeah." "Why are you smiling?" He hadn't realized he was. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." "Lucky we almost died. Multiple times." "I know, but we didn't. And now we're here building something, together. That's as lucky as a man like me has any right to expect." She studied his face for a moment, then reached over and took his hand, dirt and all. "Maybe we make our own luck. Maybe that's the secret." "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe I just happened to be at the right river at the right time." "Easy," she said softly, and for a moment he didn't understand. Then he remembered those were the first words she'd said to him, or that he'd said to her, he still wasn't sure which. Easy it hurts. A connection forged in pain that had somehow transformed into something else, something worth fighting for. "Easy," he repeated, squeezing her hand gently. They worked until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible way and somehow made something good from it. And when they finally went inside, tired and satisfied and ready for whatever tomorrow brought, the mountains stood silent witness to their survival. Because sometimes in the West, courage wasn't about the gunfight or the chase or the violence that men inflicted on each other. Sometimes courage was simpler than that. It was choosing to live when dying seemed easier. It was trusting someone when trust had been beaten out of you. It was building a garden in hard soil and believing something beautiful could grow. Clara May had run through hell to find freedom, and Jed had survived a war to find purpose. Together they'd found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. They'd found home,